Welcome. This demonstration is brought to you by Digital Den. In this demo, you will use the AWS Config service to monitor changes to specific resources in your AWS account, such as Amazon EC2 security group settings. You will define which inbound ports should and shouldn't be open in a security group. You will use AWS Config to identify changes that could be a security concern, such as a user modifying an Amazon EC2 security group. You will then integrate AWS Config with AWS Lambda to automatically remediate specific security incidents of concern. For example, where someone modifies a security group's inbound rules and they no longer conform with the desired configuration. After completing this demo, you should be able to do the following. Create AWS Identity and Access Management roles to grant AWS services access to other AWS services. Enable AWS Config to monitor resources in an AWS account. Create a Lambda function and import function code. Create and enable a custom AWS Config rule that uses a Lambda function. Test the behavior of an AWS Config rule to ensure it is working as intended. Analyze Amazon CloudWatch logs to audit when AWS Config rules are invoked. Let's get started. In Task 1, you will create two custom IAM roles. AWS Lambda and Config will use these roles later. Firstly, create a role that you will attach to a Lambda function that you will create. This role will define the permissions that the Lambda function will have when it runs. The policy will allow the Lambda function to add or remove inbound rules on Amazon EC2 security groups. The policy will also allow the Lambda function to create and write events to CloudWatch logs. Navigate to Identity and Access Management. In the navigation pane, choose Roles. Choose Create Role. For Trusted Entity Type, choose AWS Service. For Use Case, choose Lambda. Choose Next. Under Permissions, choose Create Policy. A new browser tab opens. Navigate to my GitHub repository for this demo. The link can be found below. Choose AWS Config Lambda EC2 SG role policy. The policy is formatted in JSON. Copy the IAM policy document. Switch back to the AWS tab in your browser. Choose JSON and paste the IAM policy document. Choose Next. Under the Review and Create section for policy name, enter AWS Config Lambda EC2 SG role policy. Choose Create Policy. Switch back to the previous tab in your browser for the Create role, and under Permissions Policies, choose the Refresh button. The AWS Config Lambda EC2 SG role policy should now appear. Select the AWS Config Lambda EC2 SG role policy and choose Next. For role name, enter AWS Config Lambda SG role. Choose Create Role. Next, you will create an AWS Config role. This will grant AWS Config the ability to use the role when you configure AWS Config in the next task. The role defines the permissions that AWS Config will have when monitoring one of the regions in the AWS account. Choose Create Role. For Trusted Entity Type, choose AWS Service. For Use Case, choose Use Cases for other AWS services. From the drop-down, choose Config. And choose Customizable. Choose Next. Under Permissions Policies, you will see the policy AWS Config role. The policy grants read-level access, mostly get, list, and describe actions to many AWS services. Choose Next. For role name, enter AWS Config role. Choose Create Role. The role is now successfully created. Under Roles, choose the Refresh button. Choose the AWS Config role link. On the Permissions tab, choose Add Permissions and Attach Policies. Under the Other Permissions Policies, choose Create Policy. A new browser tab opens. Switch back to the GitHub repository. And in the navigation pane, choose the S3 access policy. This IAM policy document grants permissions to get the bucket access control lists of Amazon Simple Storage Service buckets and upload objects to an S3 bucket if certain conditions are met. These permissions will allow AWS Config to write CloudWatch log files to Amazon S3. Copy the IAM policy document. Switch back to the AWS tab in your browser. Choose JSON. And paste the IAM policy document. Choose Next. Under the Review and Create section for policy name, enter S3 access. Choose Create Policy. Switch back to the previous tab in your browser for the Create Role, and under Permissions Policies, choose the Refresh button. The S3 access policy should now appear. Select the S3 access policy. Choose Add Permissions. The policy was successfully attached to role. In this task, you created custom IAM roles that a Lambda function and AWS Config will use in the next task. In Task 2, you will configure AWS Config to monitor specific resources in a region in the AWS account. However, before you set up AWS Config, you will create a security group, which will be used later. Navigate to the EC2 dashboard. In the navigation pane, under Network and Security, choose Security Groups. Choose Create Security Group, and configure the following settings. For Security Group Name, enter Demo SG. For Description, enter Security Group for Demo. For VPC, leave the default VPC selected. For inbound rules, choose Add Rule. For type, choose HTTP. For source, choose Anywhere IPv4. Choose Create Security Group. Next, set up AWS Config. Navigate to the AWS Config dashboard. Choose Get Started, and configure the following settings. For resource types to record, choose Record-Specific Resource Types. For resource category, choose AWS Resources. For resource type, choose AWS EC2 Security Group. For AWS Config role, choose a role from your account. For existing roles, choose AWS Config role. Recall that AWS Config role was the second role that you created in the previous task. In the Delivery Methods section, notice that AWS Config will store findings in an S3 bucket by default. Keep the default settings, and choose Next. On the AWS Managed Rules page, choose Next at the bottom of the page. Review the AWS Config setup details, and then choose Confirm. A banner appears briefly, and then the AWS Config dashboard displays. To observe the resource inventory that AWS Config created, in the navigation pane, choose Resources. The resource inventory page displays and lists the Amazon EC2 resources in your account. If the resources list displays a message saying that your resources are being discovered, wait a few minutes. It might take a few minutes for AWS Config to identify all of your resources. Recall that you configured AWS Config to inventory EC2 security group type resources. The Amazon EC2 security groups that you pre-provisioned in the region where you set up AWS Config are included in the inventory. However, notice that many other resource types also appear in the inventory. AWS Config tracks resources related to the resources that you are primarily interested in, because related resources can affect the behavior of the primary resources. In this task, you set up the AWS Config service in one region in the AWS account to monitor specific resources of interest. You then observed how AWS Config created an inventory of resources. In Task 3, you will configure new inbound rule settings in one of the security groups that is listed in the AWS Config resource inventory. The purpose is to effectively emulate a security incident. Some of the inbound rule settings that you will define during this task won't match the desired settings, which you will define in a later task. Locate the security group in your VPC. Switch back to EC2 dashboard. The demo SG security group should be open. Add inbound rules to the security group to allow HTTP, HTTPS, SMTPS, and IMAPS network traffic. Choose the Inbound Rules tab, and then choose Edit Inbound Rules. Notice the one inbound rule for HTTP connections you defined earlier. Choose Add Rule and configure the following. For type, choose HTTPS. For source, choose Anywhere IPv4. Choose Add Rule again and configure the following. For type, choose SMTPS. For source, choose Anywhere IPv4. Choose Add Rule again and configure the following. For type, choose IMAPS. For source, choose Anywhere IPv4. Choose Save Rules. In this task, you define 3 new inbound rules in the security group. Later, you will observe these modifications are identified as a security incident and remediated. In Task 4 you will create a Lambda function. You will then configure an AWS config rule to invoke the function. The rule and the function will work together to ensure that monitored Amazon EC2 security groups have only the desired inbound rules. To start, create a Lambda function. Navigate to my GitHub repository by clicking the link below. Open the AWS Config Lambda security group file. Copy the Python code. Open a text editor on your local computer. Paste the code. And save the file as AWS Config Lambda Security Group .py. Compress the file as a zip. Next, navigate to the Lambda dashboard. Choose Create Function. Select Author from Scratch. And for function name, enter AWS Config Lambda Security Group. For runtime, choose Python 3.7. Expand Change Default Execution Role. For execution role, choose Use an existing role. For existing role, choose AWS Config Lambda SG role. Recall that this is one of the IAM roles that you analyzed in Task 1. Choose Create Function. Now configure the Lambda function handler. The Lambda function handler is the method in your function code that processes events. When your function is invoked, Lambda runs the handler method. In the Runtime Settings section, choose Edit. Replace the existing handler value with AWS Config Lambda Security Group Lambda_handler. Choose Save. Next, upload the Lambda function code. In the Code Source section, choose Upload from and zip file. Choose Upload. Locate and select the AWS Config Lambda Security Group zip file that you downloaded earlier. Choose Open and choose Save. In the Code Source section, the environment pane now displays the file inside a folder. Next, modify the Lambda function description and timeout settings. Choose the Configuration tab, which is located above the Code Source section. In the General Configuration section, choose Edit and configure the following. For description, enter Restrict Inbound Ports. For timeout, enter 1 minute. Lambda functions can run for a maximum of 15 minutes. This particular function typically takes less than 5 seconds to run, so 1 minute should be more than adequate. Choose Save. In the Function Overview section at the top of the page, choose Copy Function ARN. You will use the ARN in the next set of steps. Next, create a new AWS config rule that will invoke the Lambda function whenever monitored Amazon EC2 security groups are modified. Navigate to the AWS config console. In the navigation pane, choose Rules. Currently, AWS Config doesn't have any rules defined. Choose Add Rule. For Select Rule Type, choose Create Custom Lambda Rule and choose Next. On the Configure Rule page, configure the following. For name, enter EC2 Security Group. For description, enter Restrict Inbound Ports to HTTP and HTTPS. For AWS Lambda function ARN, paste in the Lambda function ARN that you copied. For trigger type, select when configuration changes. For scope of changes, choose Resources. For resource type, choose AWS EC2 Security Group. AWS EC2 Security Group appears in the Resources area. In the Parameters section, add a parameter with the following settings. For key, enter debug. For value, enter true. Any parameters that you define here will be passed by this AWS config rule to the EC2 Security Group Lambda function. Choose Next, and then choose Add Rule. Now observe the AWS Config EC2 Security Group rule details. Choose the EC2 Security Group link. In the Resources in Scope section, choose the Non-Compliant drop-down menu, and choose All. In the Rule Details section, notice the last successful evaluation field. Initially, this field displays not available, however, after a few minutes, a timestamp will display. The initial evaluation might take a few minutes to complete. This same evaluation will also occur when any security group that is within scope is modified in the future. Notice the Amazon EC2 security group resources that are listed as in scope. While the initial evaluation occurs, the compliance value will be no results available. After several minutes, the value for each security group resource changes to compliant. Wait until you see that it is compliant. Notice that the annotation column displays permissions were modified. In this task, you created a Lambda function and configured an AWS config rule to invoke the function. The rule and the function will work together to monitor and remediate any undesired updates to inbound rules for monitored Amazon EC2 security groups. In Task 5 you will re-examine the demo SG security group now that the initial AWS config compliance evaluation has occurred. You will observe whether the security incident changes, which the modifications that you made to the inbound rules were noticed and then remediated. Navigate to the EC2 dashboard. In the navigation pane, choose Security Groups. Select the demo SG security group. On the Inbound Rules tab, notice that only HTTP and HTTPS traffic is permitted. Recall that you defined inbound rules for SMTPS and IMAPs, as well as HTTP and HTTPS, on this security group. However, the rules for SMTPS and IMAPs no longer exist. Also, recall that you set the IP version for all rules to only IPv4, but now the HTTP and HTTPS rules are defined for IPv4 and IPv6. In Task 6, you will observe the logic for the Lambda function to detect and remove the additional permissions for SMTPS and IMAPs in the security group. Now navigate to the Lambda console, and in the navigation pane, choose Functions. Choose the AWS Config Lambda Security Group function link. In the Code Source section, open the AWS Config Lambda Security Group Python file that you imported. On line 6, the function imports Boto3, which is the AWS SDK for Python. On line 16, required permissions are defined. This array includes the desired inbound IP permissions for Amazon EC2 security group resources that are in scope of the AWS config rule that you defined. The required permissions are defined in the format that the described security group's API call requires. This call is invoked on line 103. On line 166, the function checks whether the debug parameter is included in the AWS config rule. Recall that this was a parameter you configured when you defined the AWS config rule in task 4. If debug is set to true, then the Lambda function code will print additional debugging information when it runs. You can see examples of this throughout the Lambda code. The security incident, when you modified the inbound rules, occurred before you created the AWS config rule and Lambda function to remediate such incidents. During initial rule validation, AWS config detected the security incident. If you were to modify the security group again, an AWS config compliance evaluation would be initiated. The evaluation would invoke the Lambda function, and your changes would be reverted so that the inbound rules again match the desired settings. The default security groups are being similarly monitored and would have their settings remediated if changed. In Task 7, you will analyze CloudWatch logs and filter the log entries to find evidence of the remediation. Locate the logs that show evidence of the changes that the AWS config rule and its associated Lambda function made to the security group. Navigate to the CloudWatch dashboard. In the navigation pane, expand logs and then choose log groups. Choose the AWS config Lambda security group log group link. One or more log stream entries are visible in the log streams list. Choose Search All. In the Filter Events search field, enter revoking for and then press Enter. Each event provides details about the action that the Lambda function took. In one of the events, you should find details showing that the inbound rules that you manually added for SMTPS and IMAPs were removed. The other filtered events log the changes to the other two security groups that exist in your account. These security groups are also in the resources inventory that your AWS config rule is monitoring. In this task, you observed evidence in the CloudWatch logs that AWS config invoked the Lambda function to automatically revoke the modifications that were made to the security group. Congratulations! You learned how to use the AWS config service to monitor changes to specific resources in your AWS account. You discovered how to use the service to identify changes that could be a security concern, such as a user modifying an Amazon EC2 security group. You then integrated AWS Config with AWS Lambda to automatically remediate specific security incidents of concerns.